Right. Hello, everyone. It's so nice to be with you at the third annual Gender Inclusive Language Instruction Conference. I'm going to be your moderator for this first session of the day entitled Pedagogy, and the Power of Language, Politics, of Language Learning. I'm going to be your moderator. My name is Ben Papadopoulos from the University of California, Berkeley, where I'm currently finishing up a PhD. And I am so excited to be here with these next three presenters who have amazing papers to share with us. And I would just like to make sure that Véronique Perry is with us and ready. And if that's not the case, we can
Yes,
switch the
I'm,
order.
I'm
Oh, there
here.
we go.
Sorry, I hadn't. So I'm in San Francisco, as you can see. No, I'm not.
Beautiful. Very nice. All right, just to remind everyone how this panel is structured, everyone is going to get 15 minutes to talk. I'm pretty hands-off, but if you keep me in the corner of your screen, I will give you a nice little 5-minute warning. And in the chat as well. Please feel free to submit all the questions that you may have. So this is our first presenter of the day. This is Véronique Perry from Toulouse. And I'm going to present their project entitled Queering
And
the Space. Excuse me?
can you see my PowerPoint?
Not quite yet. Let's
Not
have you
yet.
share.
Okay. I'm sorry to
And I'll
interrupt.
finish the title for you. This presentation is entitled Queering the Third Space to Promote a Culture of Peace in EFL Classrooms in France.
It's a bit complicated for me today to be positive about the situation we are facing concerning monolingualism, considering the President of the United States seems to be following what France has been doing for decades, promoting English only. So I will, if you agree, expand a little bit on the danger of having a monolingual country, but later, because I think we are facing a lot of challenges, and the University of Toulouse is ready to welcome researchers from the United States if needed. Hopefully, you're in California, and maybe it's a different situation, but still. So the communication is based on what I called embodied awakening, because it's about insisting on the emotional empowerment of the students who are usually um used to having classes of language communication reduced to grammatical instruction. So that's why I talked about, because I promote a communicative empowerment and reflexivity in all its aspect. I called it embodied awakenings, and with this beautiful um, idea that through language education we can promote a culture of peace in this third space that can be the language classroom. So, but beyond before being a teacher at the university, I have been teaching English for 30 years now. I started in 1994. I had chosen to start my career as a language instructor for adults working in different professional settings, including workers in the aircraft industry in Toulouse. And I was trying to find other ways to promote at the time traditional methodology based on forcing strict grammatical rules and using translation. So the first point was to find efficient tools to communicate in the workplace and to try to avoid discrimination, implicit discrimination. So I used mediated learning with different tools at the time. In the 1990s, it was only the beginning of the internet and CD-ROMs. But mediated learning in foreign language acquisition changes the traditional role of the teacher as the bearer of knowledge. And one of the characteristics of mediation theory is transcendence, which involves going beyond the immediate goal of the stimulus, and is supposed to enhance motivation on the part of the learners, especially non-specialist students who are not particularly interested in learning a language or even do not display positive behaviors towards the area of learning English. So the target language is turned into a medium through the mediation of online resources, the additional skill of being building critical knowledge about web resources. So it's also, thanks to the European framework, a way to approach, to consider learners as social agents. So the action-based approach also takes into account the cognitive, emotional, and volitional resources and the full range of abilities specific to and applied by the individual as a social agent. So in the field of STEM students, students in the field of science, technology, engineering, and math, at the University of Toulouse, the point was to promote this culture of peace, relying on what the professional organization called IEEE in the field of electrical engineering and industrial computing. They said that they claim that they are the world's largest technical professional organization dedicated to advancing technology for the benefit of humanity. In other words, the point is to show students that it is clear that no advance in technology can be labeled as progressive if it's not for the benefit of all. So that's the main aspect of the promotion of English as a global language, as a common language, and not as a unique language or as a superior language or as a colonial language, but instrumentalizing English as a powerful language to know for science and to promote equality through the teaching and the learning of English. So that's what the UNESCO called the culture of the peace or culture of peace in 1992, and subsequent actions have been implemented. So the idea of queering the third place is basically based on deconstructing male supremacy, white male supremacy, and raising awareness about different the promotion of heritage languages, because it's a taboo in France. And I will insist on that because it's the key to deconstructing binary thinking and binary ideology in France, which is inscribed materially, inscribed in the language. So my idea, because I have been lucky to have a grant when I was when I had just graduated from a master's degree in English about the myth of the wolf in Jack London. So I had the opportunity to go to the United States and have this empowerment myself, and I became a feminist in your country. So I hope your country will be reflexive enough to fight what's happening to you. So the way to fight binary thinking was to understand that English as a foreign language can enable the French speakers to go beyond what I consider a system of constraints. And from the most material aspects of gender in English, which requires only minimal pronominal agreements, and now they is considered as both singular they, non-binary they, and plural they, fortunately, but it's never taught in France. So gender can be used also as a reflexive concept, of course, and challenge exclusive identity politics. So my way of queering the third place is to um, uh, show that the markedness in French, which is heavily grammatical, can be challenged by the minimal markedness because it's hypogrammaticalized, because you only have a pronominal gender in English. So this third beyond potentially included in English uh, enables at least French speakers they are, to have a view of the world that is beyond these binary constraints that is hammering the French syntax all the time. So it also enables students to have a glimpse at intersectional issues, meaning that the oppression of gender in France is also based on what I talked at the beginning, this national pride that we have been facing, and I will talk about that later. So, but the idea to empower students uh, in France is to have them take part in the construction of the framework. That's so my definition of gender is a system of constraints, and to consider gender as a contextual identity in the classroom, meaning that they can imagine there are other people having another frame of mind thanks to another uh, gender system, and they take part in the building of the scenario. And the classes are based on feminist pedagogy. Alors, to tell you about the gap between English-speaking countries about feminist pedagogy, it's based uh, on an article by Fisher published in Radical Teacher in 1981, and in France it was translated in 2018 in Nouvelles Questions Féministes. See the gap between uh, what's happening in English and in French. So feminist pedagogy is based on raising awareness, social activism, and empowerment. So I try to pass on these values to the students who have to build a professional project uh, based on the values promoted now thanks to the European framework that goes beyond the French national education system. And in Europe also, we have now intercultural cities. So the parallel promotion of the framework for languages and the project to promote intersectionality by integrating gender-based cross-cutting issues into the intercultural plans and strategies of the cities. So when I have my master classes, they have to build this professional project to articulate all the aims, the skills they have to be proficient in to be able to pass the degree. And so they build this community of practice. And why is it based on their personal narratives? It's because they choose what they want to study. So I'm going to give the example of a project concerning desalinization in Syria. I hope you can see it. Can you see the narration? Okay. So it's students who so in spring 19 so before COVID, in spring 2018, so students decided to work to make up this role play. We are three engineers working at the design office in Dublin, in Ireland. So they are in an English speaking country. The project is financed by the UNICEF, and they want to use their technology have to have people in Syria have access to drinking water. So it's typically one of the projects. So that's the summary they made. And it's typically the type of project that enables people to have this empowerment and uh, and uh, and choose to have to apply advance in technology to the promotion uh, of basic needs. I mean, to supplying water to a country at war. That's one of the most interesting project that I had to analyze. So the role plays and the film. So it's also to build reflexivity from the prosodic aspect to the most abstract ones and sociopolitical issues. So my point is for them to be reflexive, so they have to analyze the project with grids. And for example, that's the no late that's the base technology facing the that's the grids they have to use to analyze the project of their coworkers. So that's a grid we built the year before the project I showed you. The project, this professional project, was started in 2009 as a second project because I had the opportunity at the time to have students for 3 semesters from their third year to their fifth year, so we could work on the long term on diachronic programmation, and it was very, very empowering for them because after 5 semesters with me, we could get to know one another very well, and the trust between the confidence and the trust between the learners and the teacher myself, because I'm a very intense teacher sometimes, so they could understand my points and understand that it was for their own awareness. So see, they had to check the creativity of the plot, the ethical issues, and the professional context. Gender awareness, intercultural awareness. Gender awareness meant uh, uh, for the person hired, were they faced with stereotypes, or could they challenge gender norms or not? And also, the final outcome is what about ethics? If they uh, considered that the boss that was financing the attitude, they were faced to abusive behaviors on the part of the leaders, the managers, they could simply quit their jobs and try to have class actions, for example. So it was also to show them that they were not um, compelled to stay in an abusive and toxic work environment. So sorry, I made a mistake again.
That's okay, Véronique.
So
We'll
so
just about 2 minutes remaining, okay?
okay. So So the masters, can you see? No, you can see my screen, I guess.
I
Now
am
can you see the
there we go.
slide?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. So the main point uh, is the main project is to discuss ethical issues and to have side activities about they have side activities about child labor, for example. They have to define concepts, basic concepts for us, but for them, like intersectionality, they have to define it also. They have to challenge the their own study field through questions that for example, to you, what are the most disastrous lies about innovation in your study field? What are the conditions to be an efficient coworker in a multicultural surrounding, given stereotypes that may become obstacles to communication? So they have really to be reflexive about who they want to be and why they want to be in that field, because they will be the ones leading uh, the economy. So my point is to raise awareness, but to go from awareness to awakening, and to for the promotion of social change. So the question of communicative skills is fundamental to this embodiment, and it relies on gradually implementing activities triggering emotions and the understanding of this emotion, whether they are positive or negative, unfortunately. Then hopefully um, having them understand what are topical issues and cultural taboos in France, taboos being essentially based on heritage, languages, and culture. Because the violence sometimes that I'm faced with by people who are resisting this approach is based on the assimilationist ideology that France is fraught with, because precisely uh, of the way the French language has been instrumentalized to become to promote monolingual nations. I mean, to promote France as a nation state that became monolingual. And to conclude, I will insist on the fact that scientists and activists in France are faced with challenges relying on the instrumentation of binary thinking to impose authoritative views of gender, as if the unity of its people depended on standardized use of communication. So attempts have been made through history since the French Revolution to deconstruct male domination rooted in the syntax, but language reforms are still resented as dangerous, especially because the system with endless rules has long lived. So France is not a monolingual country. It was gradually made monolingual through the expanding use of French as a weapon of mass destruction to eradicate other articulations of gender beyond binary logic, beyond the binary logic of male domination and female submission, while other articulations offering a better creativity through other configuration of gender relations have existed in France. For example, in the Pyrenees, we have had a different articulation of gender relations. And the problem is that this view of gender cannot promote the understanding of gender as a reflexive tool concept, which is in fact meant to represent humans and promote their rights as equal individuals regardless of any type of categorization originating from different types of power relations based on sexism, classism, or other intersectional discrimination and stereotypes. So I was a bit moved to communicate today because we are undergoing really difficult times, and I thank you for letting me speak today. Uh, and I'm very honored to be part of this conference.
Thank you so much, Véronique. Please, everyone, give a round of applause and leave your questions in the chat. We're going to quickly move on to the next presentation and save questions for the end. And just so our presenters and our audience is reassured today, we're going to bump out the schedule and have about a floating 5 or 10 minutes to make sure that everyone has their time to speak and that everyone has their time to ask questions. So I'm going to introduce our next participant. Véronique, if you will please stop sharing your screen.
Okay.
Thank you so much. All right, our next presenter is Mattia Zingaretti from York St. John University in the UK. Thank you for being here. And their paper is entitled The Benefits and Challenges of Queering TESOL, a Qualitative Research Synthesis. And the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Ben. Just give me a second to share my screen. Okay. Are you able to see it? Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Well, all right. So thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks very much for having us here. I'm not alone. So my name is Mattia Zingaretti, and I'm lecturer in applied linguistics and TESOL. I think that's assistant prof in the US at York St. John University in the UK. And I'm joined today by Lucy Frere, my former MA student who graduated very recently. In 2024, and is now working as an English language teacher in the private sector in England. So we're absolutely delighted to have been invited to contribute to this great conference. And it seemed to us like the perfect opportunity to showcase Lucy's and I's research into the benefits and challenges of queering TESOL, and also to gain some precious feedback from a well-informed audience, as we've submitted this for publication and we'll probably get some revisions. So I'm very looking forward to hearing your thoughts. So since this is a short presentation, I'll just get straight into it, and I'll be giving you a bit of an overview as to why we decided to carry out this research. So to start with some background, queer pedagogy sits at the intersection of queer theory and critical pedagogy. So from queer theory, we take the understanding that gender and sexuality aren't fixed or binary, but are constructed through discourse, which means they're constructed through language, social practices, power relations. Critical pedagogy, on the other hand, emphasizes education as a site for social justice, where we want to try and challenge traditional hierarchies in the classroom and also empower learners to question the status quo. So when we bring these two frameworks together in the TESOL context, we get what we refer to as queer pedagogy, so a teaching approach that not only promotes the inclusion of LGBTQ plus learners, but also really encourages us to think and to critically reflect on how language and pedagogy themselves uphold or even challenge heteronormativity. So in our study, we use the term queer to refer to individuals whose identities don't conform to heteronormative or cisnormative expectations, and we use queering as a verb to describe classroom practices that explicitly support queer individuals, whilst also disrupting assumptions about gender and sexuality. So while there's been a growing body of work exploring queer pedagogy in TESOL, especially over the last decade, there is a key gap in the literature. Because while much of the work that has been done reflects the increasing global focus of LGBTQ plus inclusion and also broader social justice movements within education, to date, there's been no systematic synthesis that's brought together the empirical studies that specifically examine how queer pedagogy is being implemented across the globe in TESOL classrooms. So in particular, we found a lack of research that looks at what characterizes queer pedagogy, what its reported benefits are, and also what challenges teachers are facing. As I said, especially across diverse international contexts. And we know from other syntheses in TESOL that synthesizing qualitative research can actually yield powerful insights for teaching practice. For example, qualitative research synthesis on task-based language teaching yielded some interesting results. But so far, queer pedagogy hasn't been examined through this lens. So our study set out to address this gap exactly. And as you'll notice in our research questions, we used the term queer pedagogies, right? So hyphenated and pluralized intentionally to highlight the plurality and also diversity of approaches that may fall under this umbrella. We weren't looking for like a single or like fixed model of queer pedagogy, but rather aiming to understand how different educators are queering their teaching practices in TESOL across varied contexts. And our three questions were, first, what the main characteristics of queer pedagogies identified in recent TESOL research are. Two, what benefits of adopting queer pedagogies have been reported in these studies, and also what challenges educators may face when implementing them in practice. And so these questions guided both our data extraction, but also our thematic analysis. And we used a qualitative research synthesis, or QRS in short, which, as I said, is increasingly used in TESOL to synthesize findings from qualitative studies. And it was well suited here because, as I said, much of the research on queer pedagogies is small scale and also qualitative in nature. So our aim was to bring together empirical studies that were published between 2017 and 2024. And we applied these four strict inclusion criteria. So the studies had to be peer-reviewed primary research. As I said, published between 2017 and 2024. They had to have a clear TESOL focus, and they had to be qualitative in nature or also possibly mixed methods as long as they reported substantial qualitative findings. And just in case you wanted to know a little bit more in terms of how we looked for the studies, we use a systematic Boolean search strategy. So we combine terms like queer, LGBT, LGBTQ+, with terms like pedagogy, pedagogies, right? Pluralized TESOL, EFL, and ELT. So for instance, we have strings like queer pedagogy and TESOL, or LGBTQ+, pedagogy and ELT. And we conducted our searches across major digital libraries and also different journals in the TESOL field, which you can see on the screen. After screening over, I think, 4,000 records, our final sample included 14 studies, which formed the data set for our analysis. The way that we analyzed the data was to use thematic analysis to try and identify and also interpret recurring themes across the qualitative findings of the studies. So our aim was to synthesize patterns which could be found in the data, but of course we acknowledge that themes don't just like emerge passively, but they're shaped by researcher interpretation. So we try to adopt also a bit of a reflexive stance. And for example, I acknowledge my positionality as queer second language learner of English, which may have affected, right, to some extent, the coding of the themes in the data. Moving on to our coding, we followed a structured three-stage process where we had initial codes that were generated from relevant excerpts. These were then grouped into broader descriptive categories. And finally, we organized data into detailed subcategories, so noting how many studies supported each one. And I'm going to pass the ball to Lucy now, who's going to walk you through our findings with regards to the main areas that we looked at, so characteristics, benefits, and also challenges.
Okay, so looking at the characteristics of queer pedagogies in TESOL, we found that they tended to fall into three main areas. So, firstly, the integration of LGBTQ plus identities into the curriculum, such as the explicit inclusion of LGBTQ plus topics, including rights, identities, and culture. Secondly, how queer pedagogies often challenge heteronormativity in learning materials and classroom discourse, for example, through addressing discrimination and queerphobic remarks. And thirdly, creating open environments for expression through teachers sharing their own gender or sexual identities as part of a trust building and modeling inclusivity. As you can see on the slide, these quotes from the reviewed studies give a clear sense of how queer pedagogies are enacted in practice. So we see teachers introducing explicit LGBTQ plus content, for example, asking students to discuss figures who fought for queer rights. Others focus on more respectful classroom practices, such as asking for pronouns. And there are also powerful examples of creating open affirming spaces, like when a teacher acknowledges the students who speak gay lingo. And as shown in the literature highlighted the key benefits of queer pedagogies in TESOL. One major benefit was the potential for development of soft skills, for example, critical thinking. For example, students are encouraged to question assumptions and reflect on their own personal privilege and identity. Queer pedagogies can also help improve learner communication in terms of technical linguistic proficiency, but also understanding how language reflects power, identity, and context. And finally, regarding inclusion, students reported feeling a stronger sense of belonging and more able to express themselves authentically in the classroom, particularly queer students who may lack this validation in other spaces in their lives. Finally, queer pedagogies can help lower the affective filter, meaning reduce anxiety, increase motivation and self-confidence, which are evidently known to support second language acquisition. As you can see here, these quotes highlight the wide-ranging benefits of queer pedagogies in the classroom. Some of them reflect on how exposure to queer representation can strengthen students' critical thinking, for example. And others talk about the intercultural value of engaging with sexuality related topics. So, practically, queer inclusive topics are also seen as ideal for practicing the four key language skills. And several participants emphasize the affective dimension, which is valuable for language learning, of course. Now, moving on to the challenges, unfortunately, it's more complex, the picture here. Across the studies, there were four major themes regarding difficulty in practically implementing queer pedagogies. First, there's the deeply embedded belief system, so religious values, personal ideologies, and grammatical prescriptivism, which often frame non binary language use, like the singular they, is seen as incorrect. Teachers report internal external pressures here, sometimes feeling they had to self censor in order to avoid controversy. And then there's governing reluctance, so this institutional, parental, and even national level constraints. A third theme is the scarcity of adequate resources, such as lack of training in queer pedagogy, feeling less confident about using inclusive language, or difficulty finding the real materials that really reflect diverse identities. And finally, we have the limited teacher capacity. So this includes high workloads, limited autonomy, emotional exhaustion from having to manage the classroom pushback or controversy without sufficient support. So moving on, participants reported a range of concerns from the ideological resistance, such as a belief like topics, sexuality such should only be addressed at home, or discomfort with using the singular they pronoun, to broader institutional frustrations, like perceiving academia itself as oppressive or having to teach with materials that clash with their own inclusive values. There's also evidence of limited teacher confidence and teachers discussing the emotional labour involved, with one participant describing debates about gender and sexuality as draining and time consuming. So, these findings tell us that queer pedagogies are being enacted in a variety of ways across global TESOL contexts, both explicitly and implicitly. They're shown to support not just language development, but also the affective outcomes, which are aligned with Krashen's affective filter hypothesis, suggesting that emotional well-being enhances second language acquisition. We also argue that queer pedagogies could be creatively integrated with other established methods, for example, task-based language teaching and translanguaging, to support more meaningful and inclusive language learning. But of course, there are limitations. Many of the barriers we identified come down to a lack of professional preparation. So, CPD becomes essential not only to boost teacher knowledge and confidence, but to also offer practical strategies for handling these difficult conversations in class that may arise. Resistance to inclusive language, like the singular they, which, as we've spoken about, has been actually around for centuries, also reveals that it's often not really about grammar, but more ideological discomfort with gender diversity. And finally, we suggest that wider systemic resistance, whether from institutions or governments, requires ongoing researcher activism, especially in this current political climate where DEI efforts are increasingly under threat, as we know. As with any study, there are also a few limitations to be aware of. So first we analyse the findings and discussion sections of each article rather than the full text. This did help us stay close to the reported outcomes, but it may have limited the depth and contextual richness of our interpretations. And second, the use of thematic analysis. While it has been a powerful tool, it relies heavily on researcher interpretation and is influenced by positionality, of course. And finally, most of the studies we did were focused on teachers' views and practices, so learners' experiences themselves were largely absent. Based on these limitations, we recommend that future syntheses might benefit from analysing entire articles, including introductions, theoretical frameworks, to gain a more nuanced understanding. Grounded theory can also offer an alternative to thematic analysis, especially for projects that aim to build new theoretical insights rather than just identify recurring patterns. And we also suggest that future research incorporates student perspectives through perhaps interviews, focus groups, classroom observations, to explore how queer pedagogies are actually experienced. And last but not least, it'd be nice to see more studies that critically look at queer pedagogies, how they're enacted in practice, especially across varied TESOL settings and cultural contexts. So on to you, Mattia.
Okay, great. Thanks, Lucy. So just to wrap up, our qualitative research synthesis brought together these 14 empirical studies that were published between 2017 and 2024 and identified the key characteristics, benefits, and barriers associated with queer pedagogies in TESOL. We found that queer pedagogies are based or basically being enacted in very diverse ways across global TESOL contexts, from Southeast Asia to Europe, North America, and beyond, with practices that range from being more explicit or implicit, like including LGBTQ+ content, to modeling inclusive language use. The benefits are both linguistic but also affective, because they can support learners in developing also soft skills like critical thinking, communicative awareness, cultural sensitivity, while also helping them to build a sense of confidence, motivation, and belonging. There is also potential, we think, to integrate queer pedagogies with other approaches like TPLT or translanguaging, both of which can make language learning more inclusive and meaningful, as we know. But obviously, these pedagogies don't exist in a vacuum. So teachers still face significant structural and ideological barriers, including resistance due to them feeling conflicted over queer pedagogies, feeling overworked, perhaps underprepared due to lack of training, as well as also fearing potential repercussions, right, from parents or institutions, which obviously makes implementation difficult. So I think we would ultimately argue that the full potential of queer pedagogies in TESOL cannot really be realized until these barriers are actively addressed. And we think that this should absolutely be a priority for us as researchers, teachers, educators, but also institutions alike. And thank you very much. This is a list of the studies that we included in the QRS, and this is a list of the references for the talk. Okay, kind of skimming through, and yes, thank you very much. We would love to, take any of your questions, feedback, and of course, you can always contact us by email or connect with us on Tuesday.
Absolutely fabulous. And please excuse me, Lucy Freyer is our co-presenter on the paper.
Yeah.
Matthew and Lucy, thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Very exciting. If I can just have you stop sharing your screen so we can hand it to Julia. I just wanted to remind our audience and all of our presenters that time is a queer construct. It's all right. We're going to bump this out. We have about floating 5-10 minutes. We really want to hear everybody's presentations, and we really want to hear your questions. So please feel free to leave them in the chat. All right, our final speaker of this panel is my colleague, newly minted PhD and Professor Julia Donnelly Spiegelman, and they're going to be presenting their paper entitled Teacher Authority and the Power of Context, What Impact on Non-Binary Students? Take it away, Julia.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you to the organizers. Just making sure everybody can hear me. Okay. So as Ben mentioned, just to be clear, I just finished my PhD at UMass Boston, and you can find me at the University of British Columbia in the fall. In the meantime, you can use my Gmail, which is up there. So if there are any questions, if you'd like any, feel free to follow up by email in case we don't have time to get to it in this time together. So I'll be sharing some results of my dissertation. I'm going to speed a little bit through the front and end parts because I want to leave room for the students to talk, which is my priority today, is bringing you some student perspectives. So we know that we need evidence-based pedagogical practices to affirm the identities of all students, including those whose embodied and social experiences deviate from cisgender ways of being and knowing. And that's been well established if you're here at this conference that you know that. And we also know that language learning is deeply embedded within particular social and ideological contexts, and that we can't separate language or language learning from those contexts. We also know that language is very important, and that classroom experiences of identity invalidation through language, such as misgendering, can have a powerful impact on trans and non-binary students' investment and outcomes. And so the question here is not just how can we keep developing and evolving and documenting so-called inclusive language or so-called inclusive teaching practices, but how can teachers not go beyond developing techniques for gender justice teaching, but also develop greater sensitivity toward the contextual factors and the power dynamics that mediate the impact of instruction. So looking broadly, how can we as teachers harness our own power for the benefit of trans and non-binary students? So a bit about how I approach this research. I come to this research as a white cisgender queer language teacher, aiming to make my classroom and other language learning classrooms accessible to and affirming to queer students. And I come to this work with the deep understanding that students know what they need, and that as a cis person, as an adult, as a teacher, I don't have that knowledge in me, but what I can do is I can leverage my resources and my access to listen, support, provide, and uplift students. And I can go to conferences like this and have a room of 50 virtual teachers, and I can bring their voices anonymously and their experiences to bear in these conversations. And I do this through work in community, not for some abstract other them, but this is work that I engage with students, with my community, my teachers, my family, my friends, because our liberation is bound up with one another's. So this investigation and the data that you're going to see came about through a project that I created called the Non-Binary Language Alliance. This was a 6-month-long project that I ran online with students, U.S. high school students who identified outside of the gender binary and were studying French or Spanish at school. And this sort of based in my positionality as a cisgender teacher with knowledge of my resources and my limitations, I aim to provide students with sort of these three following things: connection and community for each other for students who were very often isolated in their own classrooms and communities. I was able to provide them with language, information about how language is evolving in French or Spanish in trans and non-binary communities. And I was able to provide space for their artwork, research, and activism. I recruited through an online survey. Students engaged during this time in a bunch of activities beyond the survey. So interviews, a group workshop, focus groups, monthly group meetings, weekly journals, and they produced art, some of which I'm going to show. I was able to engage a community consultant who's an undergraduate non-binary student who I was able to pay for their participation and who co-led some of the interventions. And in alignment with ethical practices recommended by Jay Puckett and colleagues, I was able to offer monetary compensation for my consultant and my participants. And I conducted reflexive thematic analysis through all of these different multimodal pieces in order to glean a bunch of stuff, but we're going to focus on teachers. Okay, so throughout all of the different accounts from and creations from students about related to their experiences in their language classes as non-binary students, related to their the way that they use language, navigate their classrooms and their schools, teachers emerged as a central factor. Everything could sort of be traced back to teachers and the power that teachers have in the classroom settings. And I identified 4 different ways that I'm going to illustrate with different student examples that we can sort of break down this teacher power and its impact on non-binary students. So teachers have authority over students' movements, activities, and over classroom discourse. Teachers have the power of representing the language and its users. Teachers have the power to correct and grade students on how they speak, write about themselves, and how much they speak in class. And they have what's constructed as superior linguistic expertise and knowledge. So we're going to look at these, each of the, I'm drawing examples from each of the 12 participants. Everything I'm going to show illustrates multiple students' experiences, although I'll choose certain examples because they're particularly illustrative. So this is one student's comments on how their teacher exercised authority over classroom activity and the impact on them. So this is from Tegan. I put this reference down there. If you want to read more about Tegan's experience, check out this article. So Tegan described this classroom ritual that they had to do in Spanish class. My teacher makes us line up at the door, and while we're waiting for the bell to ring, and then we say a password in Spanish that we're supposed to have memorized. This last one was gendered, and we had to correlate it to our gender. The last word of the password was misma in Spanish for feminine. So if you were male, you said mismo, and if you were female, you said misma. And I got corrected on that while walking into the class once because we had to say that password to be able to go in. So this is an example of a ritual that the teacher uses and probably considers to be innocuous, and yet Tegan, as a non-binary student, is forced to either out themselves in an uncomfortable way or self-misgender and in order to be physically allowed access to the Spanish class. And because of the power dynamics in that setting, Tegan didn't feel that this was something that they could speak out about and contest. Here's another example from a student called Cherry. If you want to read more about Cherry, I wrote a whole article about them. And I do recommend listening to what they have to say in a little bit more depth. So this is a self-portrait that Cherry drew of themselves in Spanish class. This is Cherry. This is their teacher. And here's what they said. The teacher is connecting to the other students and referring to them correctly, but the way she refers to me still doesn't quite connect as much as I would like it to, which is why I didn't have a line that went to me from her little speech bubble. My face on the little characters is kind of just a straight face because I don't really feel like I have a way to express my discomfort since I don't feel comfortable talking to my teacher. I'm going to contrast this with Lune's self-portrait. This is Lune. Lune is speaking French and holding a baguette. These are Lune's classmates, and this is Lune's teacher. And let's notice a contrast in the way that Lune talks about their teacher. This is Madame. She's in the front of the class teaching. Sometimes we kind of ignore the teaching, but she's okay with that. And then we talk to each other basically the entire time. It's more like a group therapy class than a French class, but we do the group therapy in French, so we're still kind of learning. So evident here is the really different role that the teacher is occupying in these two pictures, and the very different emotional experiences associated. And if we notice here, that Cherry's teacher is controlling these discourse patterns and is the source of speech. Lune here is the source of speech and the source of French, while Spanish lives on the chalkboard. And we see this strong sense of connectedness and agency here with Lune, who's speaking connected, the sort of democratic arrangement of the classroom, as opposed to Cherry here, who's way in the back and completely isolated and silent. The second theme where students recognized their teachers as being very powerful was the ability to provide representation. And students knew that representation in the language classroom was not the same thing as existing in real life. So Cherry commented on their survey, it feels like gender nonconformity just doesn't exist when I'm in Spanish class, and that's just not true. We exist, we just aren't acknowledged. So there's this sense of what I call educational gaslighting, that you're acting as if we don't exist, and yet I know that we do. In terms of seeing trans and non-binary target speakers, in terms of knowing that vocabulary and pronouns and grammatical strategies exist to express non-binary and trans identities. So as part of this project, I introduced to students some resources that I created for Students' Guide to Trans and Non-Binary Spanish and French. So Cherry and their peers during the workshop had a chance to see a lexicon of 30 different terms related to LGBT Spanish, and some strategies and resources for expressing non-binary identities. And Cherry is actually a heritage speaker, speaks Spanish at home. And their reaction to seeing these resources was actually anger. And here's what they said. There's so much, and it's just so, like, the vocabulary, it's so frustrating, like it makes me angry. Gender and sexuality are never brought up in class. I've never been in a situation where I've been able to learn about these things or use proper pronouns in Spanish class. And so, yeah, it's just crazy that there's a whole vocabulary that I didn't know about. On the other side of representation, Lune again took a photo of this test. This is a quiz that they had on the Passé Simple. They wrote this as a journal entry. I'm going to read what they wrote. We did have one quiz in French 4 about the Passé Simple, and our teacher added a lot of representation, and it made me happy. I've not encountered a lot of students who are happy when they have a quiz on the Passé Simple, but if you look at this quiz, 5 of the 15 forms, so a third of the questions, incorporate gender-neutral pronouns. So this is the impact that positive representation can have on students. The third power I'm going to go through a little bit quicker is the power of grading and correction. And many students talked about the impact of having graded work, having to make decisions about how they represent themselves on it. Do they out themselves? Do they try and advocate? Do they self-misgender? What if they get corrected? What if their teacher reacts in this or that way? And this happened for written work and also for spoken, because a lot of students were subject to oral correction by their teachers. So Irene, for example, acknowledged if we were to deviate from the gendered pronouns, we're marked down. So you're penalized for expressing yourself in a non-binary way. And Dante wrote about how this impacts their participation in class. I just don't really feel like talking sometimes in class because I'm not sure what will happen with people referring to me, which makes it hard to get points for participating in the discussion portion of the class. So actually, a coping strategy that a lot of students used when they were uncomfortable to avoid gendering themselves, to avoid getting misgendered, was to be silent in discussion. And this actively got students penalized in classes where participation was graded. And the fourth power dynamic that I want to illustrate has to do with linguistic expertise and legitimacy. And this happened because students perceived themselves as students, as learners, as non-fluent speakers, as having inferior knowledge and therefore skills and therefore legitimacy to research or research non-binary forms, or to ask anyone to use them, particularly in response to their teachers. And this included students who were very advanced in the language, and even students who were heritage speakers didn't feel that they were necessarily fluent enough to ask their teacher. So here's how Dante put it. I feel like, who am I to tell you that I want to use this different set of pronouns that we've never covered in the curriculum? So I think that when the burden is on me as a student to bring up something that an educator doesn't talk about first, I feel like it's not my place, or I feel like I don't know enough about the language, which makes it so much harder for me to actually advocate for myself because I'm already in an unfamiliar environment curricular-wise. So this is an additional power or differential to layer on these different layers of correction that can impede students from self-advocating in ways that their instructors might expect them to. And students used words like fear, judged, nervous, anxious when they talked about the idea of talking to their teachers about using different forms for them. And even Sun, who was a very confident student, wrote in their journal, I would like to show my teacher the language document, the one about the student's guide that Cherry looked at, but I don't want to be judged or turned away. So even sometimes the prospect of potentially talking to your teacher about something, even if you have a good relationship, even if they seem nice and open, was an impediment to students having that conversation, and therefore an impediment to their having language that they could use to actually describe themselves in a not affirming way. So there were contrasting examples for this theme as well. So Lun's teacher always talks about, Lun would always say, Madame always presents a non-binary way to say something, and when she doesn't know one, we make it up. The fun part is Madame's always just like, yep, make something up. Close enough. Language is made up anyway. So this idea that language is made up, French is made up, empowers Lune to be a legitimate co-creator of non-binary French in a way that feels very positive. And Jamie described that their teacher not serving the role of language expert, but serving as a co-researcher, which was another alternative dynamic that evoked very positive feelings. So Jamie describes, I remember finding the pronoun al when my French teacher and I were doing some research on the gender neutral, and it just felt like it clicked. It fits so beautifully into the delicate language of French, and I feel proud and affirmed using it. And so this phrase, when my French teacher and I were doing some research, this shows the image of a teacher that's not, that doesn't have to know everything about gender neutral language, but is there with the student doing the work and doing the research, which results in this really empowering experience for Jamie of finding their pronouns in French. So a brief summary about teacher power in the classroom. So we have these feelings evoked by these really strong teacher-student power dynamics. So this is Cherry's picture again. These are feelings of anxiety, alienation, powerlessness, illegitimacy, fear, and ultimately silence. And we can contrast that for other students, such as Lune, with these feelings of comfort and connection and empowerment, curiosity, confidence, participation in settings where teachers are creating alternative ways of interacting, where we have these more democratic classrooms, we have active students, we have relationships of mutual respect. So closing with a few implications, how can we use our power for the good? We need to decenter and reconceptualize the teacher role for gender just teaching. And this involves sharing authority over activities, giving students choice if and how to express themselves, about activities, topics, partners, movements, and also using that authority to hold firm boundaries against queer phobia in the classroom. So being able to interrupt misgendering so that students don't have to is a really effective use of that authority. We need to be thoughtful about how we exercise our powers of representation, providing tools to students for expressing different aspects of their sexual and gender identities, including descriptors, including family roles, including pronouns and discursive strategies for navigating grammatical gender where applicable, and including queer, trans, and non-binary speakers in the curriculum. Students know they exist. Show that you know that they exist too. We need to reconsider practices of correction and grading. Don't grade or correct students on how they refer to themselves unless they ask you to. There are lots of other ways we can evaluate students. And consider the dynamics and impact of public and private correction. And finally, with this question of linguistic expertise, research alongside students and empower students to be language co-creators. We are not the holders of the language. The language belongs to all who use it, and that includes students, and they need to know that from us. And finally, a lot of these power dynamics really come down to relationships, fostering respectful, genuine relationships with and among students. So to conclude, grammar doesn't determine impact. There's no single trans or non-binary experience. All of this is and in the same way, there's no one-size-fits-all inclusive teaching practice. Everything is very contextualized and very human and found in those relationships. So we've seen in this data the significant role of individual and social factors, and this includes power dynamics, which are infused in that teacher role, whether we like it or not. And we need more research that centers trans and non-binary youth in diverse contexts in order to develop evidence-based inclusive practices. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julia. Oh my goodness, I'm so inspired by my panel. I have such brilliance before me. Thank you so much to all of our 4 presenters.